And so the earliest attestations of the Decans we have are on so-called diagonal star clocks from the early Middle Kingdom, which starts from the very end of the 3rd millennium BCE. There's some likelihood that originally they were older, but this is about the oldest we have, and the term diagonal star clocks come from the simple fact that from 10-day unit to 10-day unit, the name of each decan moves up one position in this table because there is a change in the rising date of the star of about 4 minutes per day, which means about 40 minutes, well, actually it's more like 38 minutes per 10-day unit. And since the days of the night are here divided by phenomena of the stars, you can only divide that part of the night during which stars are really visible, which means normally quite a bit less than 12 mean hours. So that's why the hours of the decans are normally shorter than our days, our hours, but that doesn't matter too much. For us, the important part now is not timekeeping, it's more about iconography and functions. And there we have to keep in mind that there are several so-called families of decans, which have been differentiated in the fundamental work by Parker and Neugebauer. They have divergences in the exact decans and star parts used in them, and also in the iconography. And a first large group is what I have dubbed the classical sky image, of which you see here one example. It has quite a number of subgroups, the so-called Sen-Mut Seti 1a and Seti 1c family, sometimes with even finer subgroups. And if you look at the way the decans are depicted, most of them are not that elaborate. It's just anthropomorphic gods with some sort of head, human or animal, and not that much elaboration. And where you see the star determinants, of course, and you see some few larger constellations which are rendered visually. And otherwise, these are relatively bland personifications, but two other families are much more elaborate in the iconography, and one of them is the Seti 1b family, of which we see some examples here in the top row, characterized especially by quite a high number of snakes among them, and some of them with legs and arms. And the Seti 1b family is quite specific, not only in this iconography, but also in a further point, because in most of the attestation, it expands the set of 36 decans by including 12 so-called pseudo-decans through the series, and the name of these pseudo-decans do not correspond to any name of a decan attested elsewhere, but at least a substantial part of them can be identified as being identical to names in a system of chronocatorial goddesses involving mainly 12 hippopotamus deities, and the important name we need here is the name of the son of the hippopotamus goddess, which is quite often proven to be identical to names of pseudodecans. There is a late heretic handbook of religious knowledge which allows a somewhat finer structuring, because typically there are 12 groups of always 4 decans for one Egyptian month, which is comprised of 3 10-day periods, or we can call it decades. And of those 4 units, the first one is called goddess, and has the figure of a mostly sitting, sometimes standing, lion-headed goddess. Second figure in the group is called the god, and that's always lion-headed man standing. Third item is in most cases somewhat snake form, but this is the position with the most variable one. And the fourth one is normally a serpent, erect serpent, either just standing on its tail or having legs and very often presenting wine bars. And this final one is called the arrows. And astronomically, there is definitive evidence that the Ceti 1b family was used for time measurement by means of the culmination of the stars. For the classical sky image, it's less certain, but most likely there the rising of the stars in the eastern horizon was the event marking the onset of a new hour. And now the other important family we have is the so-called Tharnes family, of which we see some examples here in the bottom row. And this has a lot of iconographic variation, no clear pattern of repetition, and it might be that in some cases, at least the image chosen for a Decan is due to either religious considerations or phonetic allusions, so-called wordplay, created by his name, and very often, as also is the case here, the Decans of this family are depicted standing in barks, and the Tharnes family comes about considerably later than the other ones and is not attested before about the middle of the first millennium BCE. It's still not quite certain why it was created, but I have the suspicion that the Egyptians intended by it to bring in line their system of the Decans with the ecliptic and the zodiacal circle. Now, in what follows, I will trace the evolution which led to the use of this group or individual figures from it in magical rituals. Already in the earliest attestations of the very late 3rd millennium BCE, the Decans are labeled as gods, and furthermore, they get tutelary deities attached to them, in most cases specifically from Osiris and his family, so they possess higher powers, at least to a certain degree, and in some cases, already in the New Kingdom, especially the Ramesside period, about 1300 to 1070 BCE, they can be attributed short speeches in which they promise to the king certain gifts. Well, those are not really very specific. As a matter of fact, it's quite force and strength, and sometimes also provisions, so more or less just what gods give to kings at that time. But this shows, at least globally, that they can interact to the advantage of men. And in some cases, we have these personifications depicted in an adoring pose, which underscores their subservience and goodwill. Now, the first tangible evidence of clear connections of the Decans with magic comes from a rather late period, is linked more globally with the whole group than with any specific individual figures. And now we move mainly into the 1st millennium BCE. From that time, we have the so-called regular amuletic decrees, and they typically contain first-person pronouncement supposedly uttered by one or more important deities in an oracular consultation and guaranteeing protection against a great number of perceived dangers for the beneficiary of the amulet in question. In most cases, probably a small child. 2 of them contain quite similar utterances like, "We shall keep her safe from the gods of the decade who follow upon each other." So 10-day units, we see the link with the Decans. And those are not the only celestial entities which play a role in these texts. Several times also the 7 stars of the Great Bear, or more precisely the Big Dipper, also appear as dangerous entities in these texts. We should keep in mind, of course, that the Big Dipper was connected by the Egyptians with the god Seth, who killed his brother Osiris in the form of a bull, and later he was punished, and a leg was cut off from him and thrown into the sky. That's the Egyptian way of looking at these 7 stars. They are the legs of a bull, and since they are connected with the murderous god Seth, they are a rather dangerous group. And in these text groups, we have also several times mentions of protection from stars falling from the sky, often together with the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. So the group of the gods related to the decades can appear as one of several dangerous celestial entities from whom protection is needed. And this can be documented further from the archaeological side, especially from the later Third Intermediate period. We know numerous actual amulets, typically made from turquoise or green-colored faience, which depicted either the whole groups of the Decans or a shorter selection from them. The Decans are shown in iconography typical of the so-called 31B family, as I have said already, typically characterized by a high number of snake figures, especially snakes with arms and legs. But unfortunately, for a long time, modern scholarship has misinterpreted these depictions, especially if there were only some few of them present on the object in question. Laszlo Kakoshi has in principle clarified the question already in the early 1980s and established that these amulets depict the Decans, but up to now quite a number of publications mistakenly identify these snakes as Necheb cow. As a matter of fact, this still seems even nowadays to be the majority position of Egyptologists. Probably this is just one more demonstration of the painful fact that on average, Egyptologists are just average. There are some actually rather few relatively large figures like this one, which depict the complete set of the Decans of the 31B family, or at least a substantial part of them. And those have generally been recognized for what they really are, simply because there are so many figures available on them that hardly any other interpretation would be possible. On the other hand, if we have the smaller amulet fires, with lion-headed goddesses having a few, normally about 2 Decans on each side of the throne, then we are again deep in the area of misidentification as Necheb cow. And as you see, these figures are really small, typically about 4 to 6 centimeters high, and they have a loophole here, so they can easily be attached with a string to your neck and be worn as a protection. And finally, there are other types of amulets where we have, for example, here, figures of Decans just on their own individually, and also the so-called manid, which started as a counterpoise weight for collars, but also was important as a rhythmic musical instrument, especially in rituals for pacifying the dangerous goddess. And that's why models of these manids in faience were also an important object for amulets. And as we see on this one, here also we have quite a number of Decans depicted. Archaeologically documented specimens from cemeteries show that this type of images was used during the Third Intermediate period, probably more specifically during its endpoints from the late 22nd to the 25th dynasty. As you see here, this is one archaeological find which has at least a broad datation. It's actually quite likely that the iconography of the 31B family as snake family figures in similar dates back earlier, because from the Kantir, the Ramses city, the capital of the Ramesside period Egypt, we have a lot of faience models, not figures, but clay models in which you press the faience, and there we have some figures which can hardly be anything else than iconography of the Decans in the 31B family. So it's very likely that this iconography was already around during the late 2nd millennium BCE, and that they were worn as amulets by the living, but for some reason not yet deposed in tombs. In some cases, we have the sequence of the Decans of the 31B family also depicted on bracelets. Rather long known are 2 bracelets of Prince Hornacht from Tarnis from the 22nd dynasty, and they depict sequence of the Decans on 2 relatively divergent looking bracelets. The first of them carries a rather short inscription. We bring about protection for the first prophet of Amun, the king's son Hornacht Reveret. The second one gives a more elaborate note, as you see here, words spoken by the gods and goddesses of heaven, earth, and the underworld. We cause protection over you. Our Shesaru demons, they shall protect your body for life and strength. The god's mother is as a shield around you. May you be exchanged for small cattle and birds. The first prophet of Amarasonta, the king's bodily son, his beloved Harnacht, he is your son. His mother is a king's wife and daughter of the lord of the two lands, Karoma. And probably I have to explain this conception of being exchanged against small cattle and birds, because during that time there was a conception that the life of somebody, when in principle it was forfeited, could be prolonged by providing a substitute to die in one's place. So the text spoken by the gods and goddesses means that in all eventual situations of danger, the beneficiary would remain healthy and alive, and animals would die in his stead. To be noted is this specifically the Shesaru demons. Here you see the writings are indicated as protection. This is a term, as I have told already, for the fourth category of the Decans of the Seti 1b family, the one normally depicted as erect snakes, like for example this here. And then there's another bracelet rather recently published belonging to the Crown Prince Sheshonq from around the mid-9th century BCE, found at Memphis, which has recently been published. It has a short inscription following after the depiction of the choice of the Seti 1b family, and then it just says, they provide the protection of the first prophet of, where this should be Amun, but as you see, the text breaks off in mid-word. Probably it was damaged during being worn during lifetime. And there is also a third bracelet of this type found at Buto in the Nile Delta, and it also shows a substantial number of the Decans of the Seti 1b family, typical iconography, this time without any explicit inscription. This Egyptian tradition of depicting the Decans on bracelets, used also with apotropaic value, is probably the origin of an amuletic habit rather well attested in the Phoenician and Punic culture. There we have metal foils used as amulets and depicting quite often the Egyptian Decans, frequently together with other figures of an iconographic type, which also looks quite Egyptian, but for the moment has not yet been amenable to a more precise analysis of specific antecedents. Typically, these amulets have short inscriptions in Phoenician language and script, which also stress the aspect of protection. Carolina Lopez-Ruiz has claimed that while the iconography graphic form of the Seti 1b family was already attested in Egypt in the first millennium BCE, it was not used on amulet. She wonders whether only in Phoenicia they became used as amulets. Well, as you probably suppose, I have to disagree. The evidence as available nowadays clearly demonstrates that the use of the Decans of the Seti 1b family for amulets is earlier in Egypt than in Phoenicia and quite well at home, especially in the Delta area. There is also a rather substantial papyrus manuscript with a manual for the protection of the king during the year, which invokes the Decans specifically of the Seti 1b family, complete with images. I owe knowledge of it to François-René Urbain. At the moment, it is still unpublished, and I have been asked not to circulate any image of it, so I will refrain from delving further into it. In any case, we have sufficient evidence that the collective group of the Decans was considered as at least ambiguous, if not downright dangerous, and appropriate measures for propitiating them were needed. And concerning the Egyptian tradition of amuletic figures in the shape of the Decans of the Seti 1b family, One further piece of evidence might be interesting. In the temple of Dendera, there is a depiction of these decans in the treasury of the temple, and they have labels indicating the precise precious metals from which they were made. So at least in theory, there was a set of these decans as three-dimensional figures in sumptuous execution, which could serve for rituals of protection for elite members. On a more specific level, there is a papyrus amulet from about this time found at Castle Ibrim in Nubia. This mentions the decans Heri Ibria and Menheri, and it's not yet scholarly published. There is a halfway legible photograph available, and with its help, the basic structure of the text can be recognized irrespectively of some questions of detail. A group of higher powers is invoked and asked to protect the beneficiary from all bad and evil things in the course of every day, every night, every month, every half month, every year, and what belongs to it. And well, more precisely, we should say that the papyrus has a set of two invocations which are more or less identical for the wishes, but different in the higher beings which are addressed. Actually, this here in the image is mounted in two glasses, but this is just the top part which joins directly here. So the decans Heri Ibria and Remenheri form part of the first invocations. They are separated by a name which in parts is difficult to make out, but does not seem amenable to a restoration as a decan name. And in the second invocation, there is another name written here as Achi Nech Nech. And as you see here, all Egyptologists can certainly recognize this Nech Nech is written with the determinative of the flagellum, so it's probably just a variant for Nech. And Ach Nech is the name of one of the pseudo-decans of the Seti 1b family. Here we can also note that there are figures in the lower part of the amulets, partly overwritten by the last lines of text. And if we look here, first figure is a seated lion-headed goddess with some narrow vertical object in her one hand, and in the other hand something which might be a badly executed sistrum. And where the decan Heri Ibria is actually in the Seti 1b family depicted as a seated lion-headed goddess, even if the details what she holds in her hands is slightly different. And then here where the head is a bit difficult to make out because there is writing over it, but I think this here is a lion's head with the lion's ears, and otherwise it's clearly a standing male figure, and a standing lion-headed male figure would actually be the iconography of the pseudo-decan Achnechech, which fits with my suspicion concerning the Achinechnech, which we have here. So a rather good fit for some decans of the Seti 1b family used individually in an amulet. And concerning the decans of the Seti 1b family, a bit more should be said. They are typically serving and following the lion-headed goddess Sachmet Bastet, a goddess who can be quite dangerous, sending out deadly emissaries. There are also myths telling how she herself was sent out by the sun god in order to destroy mankind completely and killed many on the first day. But then the sun god repented and decided to keep the humans alive. In order to appease the dangerous goddess, an enormous quantity of alcoholic beverage is brewed, colored red with ochre, and poured over the fields. The goddess thinks that it is blood and wants to drink it. Thus, she is seriously intoxicated and unable to proceed with her killing spree. This mythological episode leads to the fact that in the temple cult of goddesses, alcoholic beverage plays a substantial role. And also the decans are involved here. If we look closely at the image, we see that many of them carry jars in the typical form used for wine or a special cocktail made from beer and fruits. This should make it a bit clearer why images of the Decans, often in combination with the dangerous goddess, came to be used as amulets. It was supposed that they would help to ward off dangers and pestilence potentially sent by the goddess. There is also a scene in the temple of Hebes in Chaga or Isis dating to about the 5th century BCE, where we see the king presenting offering to the Decans in the iconography of the Seti 1b family, and here also you can easily recognize the wine jars. Then we have a text in which it is attested on the one papyrus in the British Museum, probably late Ptolemaic or early Roman, and several temples from the Greco-Roman period. And this is in principle a description of the Decans and their appearance. And one passage is particularly notable, namely, who keep alive and kill evildoers according to their will, who shine in the sky and shoot the land with a fire, at whose appearance everybody trembles. Now I've put the evildoers in brackets because the different versions of this passage disagree about whether to include or not to include it, and this makes for serious difference. If the Decans kill only evildoers, then people who behave correctly should not be at risk. But if they kill randomly at will, then there is real danger for everybody. So evidently, the Decans are seen here as potentially quite dangerous entities. It makes sense that magical protection from them was sought. While the complete text most likely combines descriptions of different Decan families, I suspect that the passage in question is linked specifically with the Seti 1b family. The next complex to be discussed is Maleficia, namely an astrologically determined ascription of specific celestial bodies to specific parts of the human body, most of the time in a clear linear structure working from the head of a man to the feet. There are systems operating with the Egyptian Decans as thirds of zodiacal signs. They are so far not attested in Egyptian language, but only in Greek and Latin treatises, where it has to be discussed how many Egyptian traditions are preserved in them. Well, the global concept of so-called deification of body parts is very well attested in ancient Egypt. Basically, it means that each body member is subordinate to a specific divine master who takes care of it. However, in Egyptian sources known so far, we do not have any single attestation that the Decans are used. But now we come to the actually attested treatises. The first one is the so-called Sacred Book of Hermes to Asclepius, transmitted in Greek language. It is couched in the form of a revelation by Hermes Trismegistus, a figure having roots in the Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth. And Asclepius, in turn, is the Greek equivalent of the Egyptian Imhotep. Imhotep was originally a high official under King Djoser in the 3rd millennium BCE, is supposed to have been responsible for building the pyramid and surrounding building complex of that king, and was later deified by the Egyptians and increasingly seen as a wise authority with a special focus on healing as well as astrology. And obviously this makes him a very good fit for being the receiver of a manual of astrologically based health protection. In the Greek treatise, first the 12 zodiacal signs are introduced, each governing a certain part of the body. This is quite universal in astrological systems. That's why I illustrate it with something totally different. The treatise in question is more specifically making use of the Decans, who are now understood as a third of a zodiacal sign. And for each Decan, the text indicates first the name, then the iconography, then the illness it governs, the stone into which its figure should be engraved, the metal in which this gem should be enchased, and finally injunctions to abstain from certain foodstuff. Perhaps this can be best demonstrated by providing a sample translation. I simply choose the very first Decan. Aries first decan. This one has the name Kendachori, and he has the figure indicated below. He carries a scepter like somebody holding it away from his head. He is clothed from the feet until the knees, where it's really written like that in the Greek text. I suspect that this is a corruption. It should rather be from the loins until the knees, so with an Egyptian kilt. He rules over sufferings concerning the head. Engrave him as indicated in porous Babylonian stone, put the plant Isophrys below it, and enchase it in an iron ring. The Deccan names in this treatise can still be identified as Egyptian, even though they have somewhat suffered under the hands of the copyists who have distorted them considerably. Furthermore, the modern editions by classical philologists have failed to check back with Egyptological competence, and quite often the best readings for the names have been relegated to the critical apparatus. I was able to work out that the text makes use exclusively of the Deccan names from the Seti-1b family, so this fits rather nicely. The iconography described in this treatise has rather close parallels in another Hermetic treatise extant only in a medieval Latin translation. This also gives the names of the decans, but the transmitted forms are completely different from the Greek treatise. For a few of them, it's still possible to propose Egyptian origins, but others are completely opaque, and even when you can make proposals, they involve quite a number of emendations, which makes them somewhat problematic. They might be from the Seti-1b family, but the evidence is not really that hard and fast. The interesting point is that in spite of this serious divergence in names, the images are rather comparable, and they are also comparable to several archaeological objects. Most famous among them two ivory diptycha from Grain in France, which preserve most of the 36 figures and also preserve the names of the decans written here in Greek letters, again clearly in Egyptian tradition, but seriously different from the sacred book in Greek. There's also the more monumental Tabula Bianchini found on the Aventine in Rome, and then fragments of a glass plate found in the oasis of Douche. This iconography is clearly standing in an Egyptian tradition, even if most of the figures are quite different from the traditional Deccan imagery of the Seti-1b and the Tanis family. In some cases, there are also isolated figures of this tradition found in actual gems. By far the most frequent one is the type of the lion-headed serpent called Chnubis. There is at least some evidence that the texts did not remain entirely theoretically, but were sometimes actually used in gemstones. I suppose that Fabio Spadini will tell you more about this in his presentation tomorrow. Here also a translation sample. The first decan of the lion has the face, prosopon, of Saturn. He has the name Saloias. He is the lord of the stomach. He is a big serpent with the face of a lion having sun rays around the head. He rules over the region of India. In one point, the Latin text, if taken literally, is often systematically different from the Greek one. The Greek one more neutrally always says that the decan in question is the lord of some specific body part. The Latin one does so in some cases, including my sample translation, but in many others, he more specifically indicates that the decan is causing pain in the body part in question. This makes him more obviously sinister. Still, in practice, I think that the users of the manuals would have cared little for these subtle differences, and in any case, have seen the decan as a figure to deal with for good health of the body part in question. There is also the Testament of Solomon, a composition supposedly presenting King Solomon as a master of the demons who forced them all to appear and reveal their secrets. One group of them are 36 elements, rulers of the world of darkness, and they are quite obviously in the tradition of the Egyptian Decans. The summary description of their appearance with heads of different animals fits quite well with the iconography of the Hermetic treatise already mentioned. Each one of them indicates which sort of harm he produces and by which means he can be driven out. Most of their area of influence concerns illness and suffering, but there are also some more globally social problems. For example, the 11th demon produces strife and discord in houses, and the 34th sends envy and rivalry between friends. The 36 figures all have individual names, but hardly any of them is amenable to a satisfactory analysis as Egyptian, and in no case I'm convinced that they go back to genuine Egyptian Decan names. So we have to note that the originally Egyptian concept became mixed up with quite different elements. Further to be mentioned is the so-called Greek and Jewish Decan list preserved in two medieval Greek codices. It displays the specialty of writing the names of the Decans and sometimes also some other indications in a sort of cryptography derived from the Hebrew script. And it resembles the Testament of Solomon insofar as the medical aspects are mixed up with quite different aspects of magic. For example, the third decan of Cancer can give you true dreams. The second decan of Leo gives the wearer of a ring happiness and favor. In some cases, special inks derived from plants or animal substance are used. This can be compared to some degree with indications given by Pliny the Elder about practices of the magicians, which by modern scholars have been linked more specifically with Bolos of Mendes, a city in the Egyptian Delta. And on the other hand, the Graeco-Egyptian magical manuals have also some comparative indications for writing substances. The Egyptian system of applying the decans for healing purposes can also be found in an indication preserved by the Christian church father Origenes in his book against Celsus, who had attacked Christianity. Celsus, as quoted by Origenes, says that the Egyptians invoke the names of the decans and thus heal the patient. He indicates some names, not all, but at least enough to get an impression, and they are all clearly Egyptian decan names. At least two of them belong specifically to the Tanis family and are not present in the 31b family. So this is quite important for demonstrating to us that the 31b family of the decans is not the only one which can be used for healing purposes. There is also the curse tablet Louvre MND 406, which explicitly mentions the 36 decans in line 8 to 9, as well as the 5 planets and the 2 luminaries, so Sun and Moon. And perhaps it also includes the Liturgoi as a subdivision of the zodiacs, with 7 for each zodiacal sign, so in total 84. That's a bit based on my effort to make sense of a transcription of the amulet done by Ordeland around 1900, which in itself is clearly mistaken in details. So in any case, this is very much a case of cosmic magic. And since the text also mentions the 365 body parts, it's likely to be linked with a system of maleficia working according to the individual days of the year. Another curse tablet coming from Hadrumetum in modern Tunisia has a self-presentation of the magician as the decan of the mighty god Akramahalala. There's some uncertainty about the reading of the end of the name. I suspect that it's a somewhat garbled writing of the well-known figure Achramachamarai, a figure often attested in ancient magic, likely to derive from the Aramaic formula uproot the magical spells. So what I've presented so far is relatively easy to control because either the decans as a complete set are represented, or at least a substantial sample with clearly recognizable names, like the case of Celsius, or if it's an individual, it's at least somebody clearly called a decan. And there are other aspects a lot more difficult to establish, where individual decan names might appear in magical texts of the Greco-Roman period. Here we are often on shaky ground because this is all about how much phonetic similarity we require and how much garbling we postulate. Previous proposals for recognizing Egyptian decan names in the Greco-Egyptian magical texts have been sometimes, well, let's say, rather optimistic. I will present mainly the rather clear cases. First is Afud, which phonetically could easily be the decan name Ibjes with a development to Ibtes. The context does not help all that much, but at least we can see we are clearly in an Egyptian context, given that the gods Amon, Osiris, and Isis appear, and the text also brings up the motive of protection of the Egyptian gods from the giants, and this can be linked with a late Egyptian mythological development, which I have recently recovered, that the Egyptian tradition of Apopis as the snake-shaped arch-enemy of the sun god was crossed with the originally Greek idea of a war of the gods against the giant, and that in this war, as also attested by Diodorus, Osiris as a living being was at the head of the Egyptian army. Then we have a somewhat similar name, Afu, which might be a rendering of the same decan, but the missing final sound causes some suspicion. The magician begins his recitation by declaring, "I am the god in heaven, Afu." And that, of course, sounds quite fitting for a stellar decan, but the following names, Ach, and then some lacuna, and then Abrasax, are not evidently in favor of recognizing Egyptian traditions. Then the name Eru, which would be a phonetically fitting rendering of the decan Aret, because the final T is dopped in pronunciation. This occurs in a complex erotic charm in PGM4, and the likelihood of an Egyptian background is heightened by the fact that the invocation also contains the sequence Aroer Chnuf, and this is with a rather high likelihood the decan Chnubis, combined with the god Haroeris, who is his tutelary god in the system of the Tanis family. In its final form, the practice seems to be a complex combination of Egyptian and Jewish elements, which I cannot disentangle in the framework of this lecture. Eru can also be, Eru also occurs in the so-called Mithras liturgy. That is a text which would need more in-depth analysis than I can provide here, but the name in question is that of one of the 7 virgin goddesses of destiny. I suspect all of their names to be of Egyptian descent, and furthermore, Eru is directly followed by Rombrières, which could be reasonably understood as a rendering of the decan Remenheri, who in the astronomical sequence directly follows after Aret. Then we have the gem Fröner 2829, equally with the name Eru, and there might also be another decan name. That's a question of how to segment this scriptio continua. If we understand something is Ros Arbos, then the Arbos could theoretically be understood as a form of the decan name Heri Ibria. In any case, here also the Egyptian traditions are strongly intertwined with Jewish ones, like the god seated on the cherubim. Then we have Kat Si Kat in an old Coptic section in the Greco-Egyptian magical text, and in demotic writing Gat Si Gat, where this is quite obviously the sequence Ket Sa Ket, 2 directly sequential decans, and where the first attestation is in a badly broken passage, it's difficult to analyze it. The second one is in a demotic spell for gaining favor, better preserved, although also somewhat incomplete. the Egyptian mythological background is very clear, especially a link with Heliopolis, the Egyptian city of the sun god. It might be a bit more challenging whether also the name Bikt at the beginning of the same line could be linked with the Deccan name Bekati. That would be phonetically possible, less easy to demonstrate positively. Then we have the Deccan in a Demotic Roman period magical manual, which can be identified as the Deccan Chau, as recognized by Alexandra von Lieven. Unfortunately, Robert Rittner has made a misidentification as the Deccan Achui. This was due to the fact that he worked from Butch, gods of Egypt, where a non-existing modern emendation was indicated as name for that Deccan, and more unfortunately still, even in the new edition of that text in Genf 18, the misidentification by Rittner is followed. And we can note that most probably the same Deccan also occurs in PGM 5. This is a quite similar context, also a spell against thieves. There in the Greek letters, it's written as Chou, which is reasonably well fit. Then we have Commerce, which is a good fit for the Deccan Kenemu. And the interesting point is the invocation is directed towards the headless god. And there's an iconographic tradition for the headless one as one of the Decans, more specifically the first Decan of Capricorn. And that is reasonably close to the attested astronomically possible positions of Kenemu. Yeah, and now to warn you how difficult this area can be, because directly after this Come, who is reasonably well understood as a Decan, there comes Yaswe, Bibiu, Nusi, Sieton. And in the Genf new edition, it was proposed to recognize here Decan names. And at first sight on paper, this looks quite reasonable, because Biu as well as Seed are really ascertained as renderings of the Egyptian Deccan names with Hephaestion. But there are fine details which are clearly different, and in reality, this sequence, the Ya is just an invocation, and then Sve, where we have the Egyptian formula Shefu, Ba'u, Rem of Rems, Bak of Baks, as demonstrated by Jan Assmann, an Egyptian formula attested from the New Kingdom onwards, mostly in more esoteric contexts, invoking really powerful gods. So quite different origins, nothing to do with Decans, and also Sieton is more likely to go back to Egyptian Sata'a, great serpent. So this shows you even perceived similarity in sounds does not necessarily mean that you can really identify figures as Decans. Now, another somewhat more complicated case is the entity Tom, who occurs in a spell of divine revelation. There are clear invocations of Ptah and Ra, so this would be a good fit for basically Egyptian context. But if we have here, so to say, great Egyptian gods, then we cannot really exclude the option that Tom in reality stands for the Egyptian creator god Atum. So all this should demonstrate to you how tricky this area is and how closely you have to look. Now, do we still have time to go on, or should I finish?
How much more do you have to say?
About 5 minutes.
Fine, go ahead.
Okay, this is just about systems where something which is called Decans is clearly present, but the connection to the Egyptian roots has become very tenuous. A good example is the so-called Picardrix. That's a magical manual originally composed in Arabic in 11th century Spain under the title Rayat al-Hakim, the goal of the wise men, later translated into Latin, where it exerted considerable influence in late medieval and Renaissance Europe, and the text comprises a section describing the iconography of Decans in one of the Latin manuscripts nowadays in Krakow. This was actually worked out in drawings, but there is hardly any real connection between these images and the ancient Egyptian image type. The Picatrix Decans can be traced back via older Arabic treatises into Indian models, which in turn might derive from now lost Greek roots from Roman Egypt. But it seems that the planets and the co-rising stars are far more important for the iconography than the real Egyptian Decans. And well, in the Picatrix, there are descriptions which magical operations should be done in the face of influence of certain decans, but it seems that there are options how a planet could exercise his power, because in this conception, the decans are faces or prosopa behind which a planet hides, and it's a planet who has the real power. And well, then finally, we have also Coptic magical texts, which still make use of the Greek words Dekanos, sometimes written unhistorically as Tykanos, but they are often in groups of 2, 3, 7, or 21 entities in a Coptic apocalypse of Paul in the book of the investiture of the Archangel Michael. We even have 100 decans. So the numbers do not fit the Egyptian conception of 36 decans, and also whenever in these Coptic texts we have indications of names of these decans, they have no relation whatsoever to the Egyptian decan names. So the original astronomical association of the decans seems to have gone completely lost. And with this, I am definitely at the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this immensely learned and exciting talk. We've learned that decans are everywhere, and I'm just very impressed with the depth of what you said, and grappling to get to grips with all of the data you've given us. Perhaps there are some people in the room who've done a better job of this. Would you do we have questions or observations for Joachim? Yes, Alexandra von Lieben, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I was wondering actually whether this text you showed, which contains just 2 decans, whether those might actually have been precisely responsible for the person, say the patrons of their birthday or something like that. But of course, 2 different ones would be a problem for one day if it's 2 following weeks, in the sense of 10-day weeks or something. Do you have an idea what might be behind this?
Unfortunately, not real. I mean, you know, of course, that there are some cases where the hippopotamus deities seems to be linked with the birth dates of person, but here with this amuletic papyrus from Kassel Prim, I don't think it works out. And if we have also this Ach-Neches, then we are at yet another position, and it becomes very tricky unless there are several important parts in the life of a person to be covered. So it's really an unsolved question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Do we have any other questions? Yes. Yes, Pat.
So thank you for this Thank you.
You mentioned the name Afud from the PGM 57 in the context of the Gigantomachia. And can this context shed light on this well-known type of adjective connected to Knubis, Barophita, Gigantorecta, and so on and so on?
Most likely, yes. As a matter of fact, in my publication of the demotic fragments relevant for the tradition of the war of the gods against the giants, I already brought up that point. That's published as one contribution as in this big collection of text editions, the Carlsberg Papyri 11.
Great, thank you.
Yes, Fabio.
Thank you very much. I have just a quick question out of curiosity. What is what do you think about the influence of the Gliedervergottung in developing Melotesian Roman time that appears with Manilius? Do you think that it could be more from a cultural transfer from Egypt or more from Mesopotamia, or we don't have any precise idea?
Yeah, that's an important question. I would say at the moment, Mesopotamia has a bit of a head start because we have better documentation from Mesopotamia concerning the last few centuries BCE, where scholars recently have managed to uncover systems of Melothesia really linked with astronomy. And so far in Egypt, we do not yet have it, but I would say it's simply for us a problem with a dearth of data for the pre-Ptolemaic and early Ptolemaic periods, and those would be the crucial ones. So at the moment, I would not pronounce a final judgment.
Yes, we have a question, an online question from one of our online participants, Jen Sirin.
Hi, I have a question. In astrology, each decan had connection to the planetary, whether that's like, like Mars and Saturn and all that. And in ancient Egypt, is there a particular decan within the increment of 10 that connect to particular god or goddesses?
Well, first point is the decans are in principle stars, fixed stars, so not really linked per se with any planet, but in the Greco-Roman astrology, systems were worked out where decans and planets could be correlated by this system of the so-called phases or prosopa, where it's a rather simple schematic distribution where you, so to say, more or less just go run through the decan system with the planets and just in sequence distribute them as long as you have positions to fill, which means that Mars gets one more than all the others. But that's a later system, relatively arbitrary. In India, there are different systems which by the Arabs also come to Western Europe in medieval times, and were concerning decans linked with gods. There are different systems in these different families of decans. That's one of the reasons why it's so important to always keep in mind the families and not work with the decans just globally.
I see. Very cool. Thank you so much.
And so Joachim, there are the different families of Egyptian decans that you spoke of. They have they can have quite radically different functions than within the culture. They exist side by side, synchronically, but they mean quite different things.
Yes, they exist relatively synchronically. It seems that their use was, at least in some cases, linked with specific types of monuments. For example, the Senmut family is found on water clocks, and other types of the celestial star image are found on the ceilings of tombs, and the SETI-1b family, where on ceilings they appear only in one very, very specific composition, and otherwise they are more often attested as these loose figures with a more demonic character. And then there's also some historical development in it, because the classical sky image gets more or less out of use increasingly in the Ptolemaic and Roman period. That's why for the Greco-Roman period, you mainly have to deal with the SETI-1b and the Tarnis family.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other questions in the room? Well, then, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joachim, for this wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for coming, both online and here.